Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, okay. There is no sign that you can't hear me, so I suppose you can hear me. I am really delighted to be here today with you on the fourth Biennale in Reykjavik. So I would really like to thank the organizers for having put together such rich and interesting program and reflecting on the different facets of validation. Now, I will have a difficult task because there was, of course, the fantastic speech by John Gnar, which I really enjoyed a lot. And I was thinking when he was talking about the office that I'm indeed sitting in an office, not together. I'm not together with you. I'm sitting in my own office. There is no big telephone anymore, but I'm speaking to a screen, yeah, which looks, of course, a bit unhuman. But yeah, I hope it's a second best approach to be part of the Biennale. I also have the challenge, of course, to come after Pedro and after Marie, who both had very interesting perspectives. Pedro thinks a lot for all the conceptual perspectives also around validation, and Marie for all the work that UNESCO is doing, which I think is great. Because validation only works if there is a true culture of lifelong learning. And we have seen that such culture entails many different elements. I will indeed this morning bring the EU perspective on validation of prior learning, or validation of skills, or validation, accreditation of learning, however you want to call it. I think we basically refer to the same things when we talk about, when we use different terms. And in particular, I will address here the European Commission's perspective. Compared to the previous presentations, I will be much more policy oriented. I have no slides that I prepared, so I can also not share slides with you after the session, although we can, of course, always share some slides in general about EU action on validation. Now, regarding the EU perspective, I will in particular focus on what the European Union and the European Commission, more narrowly, are doing in the context of the EU skills agenda, and where validation is a key principle. It's an important pillar of the skills agenda, even though there are no specific actions on validation only under the skills agenda. But I fully agree with Pedro and with Marie. Validation is one of the pillars of lifelong learning policy. A lifelong learning policy cannot exist without validation. It's not serious. Before going into some of the actions and also a bit more the background of the skills agenda, I would like to refer to the European pillar of social rights, yeah, which is related actually to SDG 4. And this pillar contains 20 principles. And the first of these principles is that everyone has the right to education, training, and lifelong learning in order to maintain and acquire skills that enable them to fully participate in society and to manage successfully transitions in the labor market. So this really is very important. And my reading of this principle is that validation falls under it because it's part of lifelong learning. And then this pillar dates back to 2017. And a few years later, the EU agreed to a headline target in the field of training, namely that at least 60% of adults should participate in learning every year by 2030. And currently, we are EU average around 37, with some countries, of course, being quite high, already reaching that target, like most of the Nordic countries. I also think Iceland, but many other countries are really below the target, so action is needed there. Now I'm coming a bit more to the skills agenda itself. So why did the Commission adopt a skills agenda in the first place? And this is basically because on the labor market, we see many shifts in skills that are required due to changes. And I would like to changes in the labor market, and I would like to point to a few issues here. First of all, about 4 out of 10 employed adults in the EU are in what we call atypical forms of work. And this means they don't have full-time permanent employment. And it's not a bad thing necessarily, but it has some consequences. Some forms of atypical work are increasing, platform workers. And also the digital transition and transformation, and even reinforced by COVID, is accelerating this trend. And very often people in atypical forms of work, so not having a fixed employment relationships, have less access to training. Second, and this is of course not a new phenomenon, but still important to mention, job tenure across OECD countries has really decreased. We have figures here between 2006 and 2017. This is an important element of information. And then you also see some structural changes, of course, on the labor market, namely when we look at the sectorial dimension. So the CEDEFOP, and the European Agency in Thessaloniki, where Ernesto is working, shows that fewer people will work in mining, in manufacturing and agriculture. And there will be more opportunities in the health sector, in social care, and in other service sector jobs. And the COVID crisis has caused further shifts there. So this information is available publicly from the EU skills panorama. And finally, there is demography. When we look at the European perspective, from a European perspective, we see that population in Europe is growing older. And this means that the major resource on the labor market, namely people, is becoming more scarce. So there is the challenge of activating everyone's full potential on the labor market to ensure sustainable growth in the short, medium, but also the long term. Now, these are a couple of trends, and in particular, also this means that many people are more vulnerable and require a reinforced policy on skills to help them. Very often adults, but also, of course, younger people. And one of the current problems that we face is in this context of needed up and reskilling, of needed lifelong learning, is that many people fall through the gaps of the existing support system, for instance, because they are in a professional transition, or because they are independent or have a precarious platform employment. Now, the European Skills Agenda tries to tackle these challenges. It's of course not a single solution to this, but it aims to contribute to it. So the Skills Agenda was adopted by the Commission in 2020, and it sets out a comprehensive approach with 12 specific actions. And as I already said before, validation is a key underlying principle in the Skills Agenda, although none of these 12 actions specifically addresses validation. Validation, however, is part of the different actions. Now, one of the priorities really of the Skills Agenda is to empower individuals to acquire skills, and to also communicate them effectively to the outside world for further training or in order to get employment. So training, but also skills need to be made visible. I will now talk about some of the key actions under the Skills Agenda. And after I've done that, I will say a word also about migration. And finally, I will say a word about what the Commission is currently carrying out in terms of core activities of under the specific validation agenda. But first, some of the actions of under the Skills Agenda. First of all, individual learning accounts. So a very important action under the Skills Agenda, and the Commission launched a proposal on individual learning accounts by the end of last year. And it's currently under negotiation in the council, and it has almost come to an end. So we can trust that there will be a council recommendation on individual learning accounts adopted, still under the French presidency. And in the proposal by the Commission, that is then submitted by the Commission to what is called the Council of Ministers of the EU, that proposal is negotiated between the member states, and the Commission is defending its proposal. Now, in that proposal, the Commission outlines how member states could combine financial and non-financial support in an effective way to empower adults, to develop their skills throughout working life. So individual learning accounts are really focused on adults. There are other actions really addressing younger people, such as a renewed youth guarantee. The individual learning accounts proposal recommends member states to set up individual learning accounts for all working age adults, and also to ensure that there is an adequate provision of training entitlements, and also that there is additional support available. And the account idea is that it should allow individuals to accumulate and preserve individual training entitlements over time, and to use them in line with personal interest. And in some cases, this can mean indeed training, but one can also use, that's the idea, such accounts for career guidance, for example, to get the direction of where could one go on the basis of where employment opportunities are, but we could also imagine personal interest. And then secondly, also, of course, validation. So these accounts put people at the center of designing their own learning pathways. And accounts will also give certainty to people that they can access training whenever they are needed. And it's not so much dependent on your employer's will. That's the idea behind it, to be all inclusive. So including people who are not in under an employment contract. And as I already said, validation plays a key role in the proposal. And as part of the recommendation, the Commission has proposed member states to set up a so-called enabling framework to promote the take-up of training, but also to promote the take-up of career guidance or validation, as also costs for career guidance and validation should be eligible. That's the idea for funding under learning accounts. Then a word on micro-credentials, another action of the skills agenda. Here again, the Commission made a proposal in December of last year. And the background of that development is actually an evaluation of the European recommendation on validation of 2012. And this evaluation calls for greater development of links between validation and micro-credentials. Now, micro-credentials are very much maybe en vogue at the moment. They are, in essence, records of learning outcomes of a learner following a small volume of learning. So quite a general and open definition. After an assessment, it certifies what knowledge, skill, or competence individuals have acquired. And micro-credentials have a lot of flexibility. They can offer the modularity, flexibility, also to build learning pathways to meet, again, personal and professional needs, and can be used, of course, for further learning, further studies, or for getting work. The EU recommendation, which also is close to finalization, actually there is political agreement on the final text, so we expect adoption later this year, next month, about mid-June. Yeah, the recommendation adopts a broad approach to micro-credentials, namely covering all levels of learning, So higher education, vocational, adult learning, also for young people, and covering also different modes of learning, formal, non-formal, informal. Key also here are the learning outcomes from learning. And without a learning outcomes approach, it's also very difficult to have an approach on validation. And the proposal also invites member states to adapt procedures for recognition of prior learning and for validation of non-formal and informal learning as a way to obtain micro credentials, because why shouldn't your skills not be able to lead to micro credentials if those skills correspond to the requirements of that micro credential? A third action I would like to point to is the new Europass platform that was launched in 2020, also as one of the actions of the skills agenda. Now, the Europass platform is the EU platform for lifelong learning and career management. And it now has over 3.5 million users and is still growing, and we also are still developing it. It is the EU platform where information on validation can be found. So we have a section on validation on the platform, still a bit underdeveloped at the moment, but we want to make this more mature and will invest in it this and also next year. Of course, streamlined with validation information that is, for example, available at CEDEFOP's website. But the idea is also to connect information on validation that is available at the national level, and also to include clear guidelines for individuals, you know, where they can seek for validation, especially if you want to do that in another country as your own. Now, one of the key components also of the new Europass platform is the infrastructure for European digital credentials for learning. This was launched in October 2021, and it allows education and training providers or other organizations to issue digital credentials that are tamper-proof. So digital credentials have a lot of assets. They are safe, they're secure. Of course, there are some worries. Sometimes you hear about data protection, but they are safe and secure as such, as credential. They contain many details, and they allow also learners and workers to get a job or apply for further training. And for employers, really, assets are that they can reduce the time and cost for verifying credentials and processing job applications. And for education and training institutions, in addition, they can also represent time and cost, you know, when looking at files of applicants. Now, digital credentials, okay, maybe in first instance, you would think of diplomas, diploma or qualifications, transcripts of records, but also there can be certificates of participation issued as a digital credential. And finally, and I think this is important to stress, especially today, they also have potential for use in the context of validation of skills. Quick words on migration. So the EU, as you can imagine, is really busy with migration. The Ukraine crisis is occupying, of course, everybody. And the millions of refugees coming to Europe, yeah, also need partly access to education, partly access to work. Some migrants, refugees come with high qualifications, others come without qualifications or non-documented qualifications, but actually nobody comes without skills. And one of the crucial aspects is, of course, to avoid that people work far below, let's say, don't work in positions, in jobs for which they don't have the, that doesn't correspond actually to their skill profile. And this is also why the Commission is suggesting that its existing skills transparency tools, like the European Qualifications Framework, could help Ukrainians. And in this context, we are working on a comparison project, comparing the European Qualifications Framework with the Qualifications Framework from Ukraine. One of the concrete things we have been doing is to translate the EU skills profile tool for migrants. That's a multilingual online tool to identify and document skills of migrants that are coming into Europe. And this is now also available in Ukrainian. So this can be used to set up a skills profile that can be used for determining the further pathway of training or directly into work. And also, the parts of the Europass platform have already been translated to support Ukrainian and refugees. All these measures that also address validation will not be effective if there is not a real culture, you know, of lifelong learning, where the norm is for people to continuously learn, lifelong learning, and where there would not be a validation system in place. And we still see that in countries there is somehow less trust in validation than in skills gained through formal education and training. So a culture, you don't get it in one day, but it is very important and crucial to have validation working. So Marie, I am so happy that you made this point. But also a culture requires that systems are in place that allow individuals, to give possibilities to individuals to make the skills visible, because only when they are visible, they can also be valued. Now, I am going to close now my presentation by saying, by giving just a final word on what we are currently doing in the area of validation within the Commission specifically. So the work that we do, and that is the responsibility of the Skills Agenda Unit in which I'm working indeed, is that we are currently, together with CEDEFOP, working on the update of the European guidelines for validating non-formal and informal learning. We had an online validation event last year. We work on this in close, CEDEFOP holds the pen here. We work in close relationship with CEDEFOP. We also have set up a project group on validation. And basically the work that we do still takes place in the context of an advisory group that operates under the European Qualifications Framework for Lifelong Learning, also referred to as the EQF Advisory Group. So these guidelines are near finalized, but there will be a process of consultation in autumn, and we hope that they are finally adopted and can be published more or less by the beginning of next year. Another element, a key element of work for us, is the European Inventory on Validation. So this is actually the key document that sets the state of play of implementation of validation arrangements across Europe. And we have an external study that we will soon contract by the Commission, and this new contract will update all the country reports under the inventory, and that includes also Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland as non-EU countries. So it's really a big overview document. We want to make the document a bit more attractive and come with a more interactive presentation in the end. In terms of timeline, the study will start hopefully in July, and then we will have a good 1.5 years before finalizing the study. So this is really the key document that contains empirical information about where validation stands in the countries. And then the final point that I would like to mention is that we will also organize a validation festival next year in 2023, spring, May, June. We haven't fixed the date yet, but the purpose is to have a physical event. I hope many of you will be able to be present there at that physical event. And in the validation festival, really the focus is also on exchanging practices, policy development, but also exchanging practices. And the first festival that we organized was really a very much inspiring event. Now, with this presentation of development, I would like to finish, and I am wishing you a very interesting second day of the Biennale, and I'm looking forward to your results.